Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. The Web Platform Podcast is a proud O'Reilly Media partner. As such, one of the benefits we provide our listeners, that's you, are special discounts such as 50% off of ebooks and 40% off of printed materials. So this includes but is not limited to books on web technologies, as well as other technologies you may be using. So your discount code is all caps PCBW. That's PCBW, all in caps. So head over to O'Reilly.com, that's OREILLY.com, right now to get all your favorite tech books at much lower prices. Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. This is episode number 65, Strand and Web Components. Today on our panel, we have Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, wonderful people.
Myself, Eric Isaacson.
Hello, Eric.
Hello, Justin. We have some guests today from Math Media, some developers, Anthony, Dan, and Justin. Do you want to introduce yourselves in that order?
I am Anthony. I am a contributor to the Strand library and a UI developer here at MediaMath. And I like pretty designs and making things look nice.
Nice.
I'm Dan Lasky. I'm the team lead for the Strand team here at MediaMath, and I'm also a UI developer.
Hi, I'm Justin Moore. I'm an architecture developer on the UI framework team here at MediaMath, and I'm the resident language snob.
Language snob. That sounds interesting. Are you like a Haskell guy, or are you? What do you
Haskell is the flavor of the quarter. This quarter, yes.
Nice.
I'm checking out Elm. I'm checking out Haskell. Maybe a little OCaml.
That's awesome. I can't keep up.
I was trolling him last week that he needs to start a newsletter that's just Justin's language of the month. So not what he likes, but
there's a lot out there. It's good though. Get new ideas from new areas. We brought you guys on to talk about Strand, the library today. It's built on top of Polymer, but I'm sure that most listeners, unless they're immersed in the web components world, don't know what Strand is. Can you guys talk to that and how it came about, why it's built on Polymer, and why developers should really start using it?
Sure. So I guess we kind of have to dig back into ancient history a little bit to to get into that, which is in 2013, myself and another developer who's actually on this team went to Fluent, and on the last day of Fluent 2013, we were sitting there kind of like tired because it's, everyone's been there for 3 days, and we're like, oh, and I sat through Eric's talk on web components, and it was just like, I went from kind of like, hunched over on my chair to like bolt upright going, wow, this is exactly what we need to solve a fairly pressing problem that we have in MediaMath, which is that we started with a web application that was built, I think, originally by a team of 3 or 4 people, and now we've scaled out to, I don't know, we're at over 30, maybe more than that.
We're at 80 to 100 developers at this point, internationally. Because MediaMath is actually a pretty big late-stage startup, and we've got an international company. We've got offices in Cambridge, Chicago, and New York, and so the growth of the company has really kind of made it imperative to make our code bases more modular and more extensible.
Now, do you guys get together internally and talk about these things, or do you do it via open source? Like, are you collaborating with all these different developers?
Yeah, so originally what we intended was to use an internal open source model, and that was working well enough that we just kind of flipped the switch as far as making it public too. So we drive our own roadmap for this project, which is largely based around looking at all the other teams' projects and seeing kind of what we think their component needs are going to be. And we're very much focused on, I look at it as sort of like UI tooling, right? This is stuff that all the other teams can use to build their stuff quicker and more effectively than they were doing on their own, ideally in a much more modular way than we'd been doing previously. And a big piece of why we wanted to use web components too was one of the things that didn't scale particularly well was CSS, and having Shadow DOM to sort of do a decent job of encapsulating that was a big plus point, I guess, for us around this.
So I take it most of the stuff you're building is internal, right, for using these components?
Definitely. We have a number of teams that build a number of UI products and widgets, dashboards for various clients. We have a Terminal 1 UI, which is kind of the main hub for our clients interacting with our service. That's actually the team that we work on, and the Strand library kind of developed from the need to modularize bits and pieces of this Terminal 1 UI, and that's also kind of where we got the branding and the look and feel from, which we've largely contributed to, normalizing that across the board, and with the idea of getting everything kind of looking and feeling like MediaMath, like this Terminal 1 UI, and like the Strand look and feel. So that's definitely one of the aims of the project.
Yeah, Web Components is sort of the buzz around it has sort of died down because, mostly because the standards are changing, and people are sort of waiting for that oh, well, I've been waiting for this forever, and it's still not in the browsers a year, 2 years later. Christian Hellman on an episode earlier had mentioned a lot of that sort of feeling of despair. But I am not dissuaded. I will keep web componenting. How do you guys feel about the library as over time? Has adoption grown? Like, what are people using it for? And because you said it's for internal use, so if nobody uses it, it's still very useful for you guys, because I'm sure you can take those pieces and plug it into other Terminal 1-like applications.
Sure, and I think it's important to note too that like our internal adoption is also like the same sort of battle that we're fighting externally too, which is like, hey, we personally are putting a stake in the ground that we think web components are the future as far as like being able to create modular, reusable pieces of functionality for complex applications. And there's a lot of UI teams here, and not all of them agree on that. So there's been a fair amount of evangelism on our part that we've done internally as well to like really promote this. And I think as far as adoption, one of our biggest hurdles has been we have a lot of legacy stuff that's built on Backbone, and people are very tied, and I think we can probably get into this in a little more detail, but people are very tied to the sort of Backbone data model. And to my way of thinking, you can use web components to sort of ease some of that as far as like how your actual UI components interact with your backend data sources, and to overall like reduce the amount of boilerplate that you have to write, especially in situations where you're doing the same type of calls over and over again. So that's been one of the bigger things, is people are using the front end components, but then they're still hooking them up to Backbone on the back end, which makes me a little sad, but I mean, it's cool that you can do that.
Backbone's good for some stuff, but yeah, to have it tied to a framework like that is, even as small as Backbone, is still a difficult thing to overcome.
The way that I see it, it's almost like sort of an impedance mismatch that you have between these two frameworks, where Backbone is kind of like I call it sort of like a manually memory managed kind of environment, and then Polymer basically gives you like this garbage collected environment where it's handling all of the difficult parts for you. It puts them in the little black box, so you don't have to think about them. But when you try to tie those two pieces together, you inherit a lot of the cruft from each, really.
You guys talked about data. I was actually going to bring this up later, but since you brought it up now, one of the things that Raphael Rougeron talks about in Bosonic and his work with web components in general is that data elements are not something that's really natural to the whole web component thing. And there's disagreements with that, I think. If you look at the HTML elements that exist that actually work with data, there's like data list, right? And some, you could argue form elements to a degree, but there's not a lot. Maybe because data has a specific API to it, a specific way that it's distributed. I know Polymer in particular wraps, or like Ajax, it wraps all these other ways of getting data and doing these things. But how does Strand build on top of Polymer and work with data in the elements?
So that's been kind of evolving over time, I think. Like when we built the first swing at this on the 0.5, well, really, I guess technically we started on 0.2, I think. Is that right? Yeah. So it's been a minute, but on the general 0.5 style stuff, we built a set of, and back then you actually had inheritance too. So we built a set of elements that kind of stepped up in terms of their levels of abstraction. So you start with Ajax, and then we created an element called sync that's basically meant to sort of mock a lot of the sync behavior that you see in Backbone that's doing a little bit higher level stuff. And then going all the way up into extremely, and this stuff is not open source because it's proprietary to our APIs, but we built a bunch of adapters essentially that were very specific to different APIs. So at the end of the day, all developers would have to do is fill in a couple chunks of markup inside of the data component, and then say you want to do a search or something like that. You could literally just use the two-way binding to drop input into either like a sanitizer element or then directly into the data component, and it will just fire that off as queries as the DOM changes, which reduces a lot of the kind of stuff that you have to spend a lot of time in boilerplate in like Backbone or even to some degree in other frameworks. So
you said two-way binding as well, and I know the trend now, at least in Angular with dealing with binding, is to do one-way bindings, and to do away with that. And I think Polymer 1.0, the way they handle properties, seems like it's moving towards that. There's still mutation observers and things like that work on the attributes, and I think it's moving towards that. Would you agree, or how do you think that you guys would move towards one-way binding as an option?
I think that we're definitely open to considering it. Two-way binding, it is proven to be a godsend for really simple data flows because it just takes care of everything for you. But as things become more complicated, it may be necessary to take a step back and really evaluate, like, can we get all of the power that we need from one-way binding? Because that is the way that a lot of frameworks are going. Mercury, React, and the new Elm stuff as well are all they're all on the one-way binding is the way to have a code that's easy to reason about.
Well, it's also too like that usually in that case you're dealing with a linear data set. So it's not like multiple data sets. You have this one data object that keeps going through, right? Where it's like single path or unidirectional, as it's called in Flux, right? So that's easy because then you can go back and look in time to see that. But when you have the one-way binding, that works great. But when you're dealing with this different complexity of multiple data sources in these different trees, that could be two-way binding may be the way to go for certain cases in there.
That may turn out to be the case, but I think ultimately there are probably ways that you can leverage both to great effect. Like I think that I wouldn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater in going completely one-way binding, but it's sort of like immutability in general. There are definitely advantages that you can get, and it's really just a matter of when are the best times to choose one over the other, and we're still working out what those times are, especially as we get into kind of more complex components. Like I did have a chance to take a quick look at like Bosonic, and yeah, they don't do much of the data integration, but we've got components for like binding data to drop-down lists, binding it to grids, and we're looking into trees as well. So figuring out exactly how the data is going to flow through those components is an evolving challenge.
So speaking of complicated things, you guys have a grid. Grids are hard. that's a big chunk of grids are sort of the holy grail of, anything on the web. Everyone seems to have one, but they never quite seem to work the way we want. And that's quite a chunk to bite off right out of the gate. I mean, how did you guys go about deciding that, one, we should build a grid, and two, you guys are all still here, so you're still sane? How'd you guys go about that?
I'm a little worried about the other Justin here. I don't know. But so, I mean, to answer the one question, which is like why we did it, and that was very definitely driven by the application that we're servicing. Like T1 just has a ton of grids in there, and they're used. It's probably like the biggest usage for the component. And maybe I should let Justin speak to sort of some of the difficulties along the way. But
so I think it's essential. It is essential to take the hard problems, abstract them, put them in a black box, so that people who craze easier than I do don't have to deal with them on a day-to-day basis. So I spend a lot of time trying to abstract away the essential parts of what makes a grid. Particularly, we use item recycling as well. So because our grids have to handle tens of thousands, if not hundreds, of records at a time, we use a recycling mechanism so that only a small subset of DOM elements is necessary in order to represent all of those on screen. So abstracting away those pieces is really essential so that the end user developers who are actually building apps and building the T1 UI can just tie in an array of data where they need to, and the stuff just kind of works out of the box. Again, I kind of see all of these abstractions as it's like garbage collection. You give up a little bit of power, but all of the work gets handled for you, and it all gets handled in one place, and you solve the problem. You solve the problem right once, and then everybody else gets the benefit from it.
Did you find that you had users coming to you for more features in that grid? I mean,
yeah.
the kicker with grids is that you look at sort of the evolution of grids over time, which is why I think it's been hard for the web to have a particularly, and there have been good ones, I mean, over the course of the last few years where grids have sort of popped up, but then you go to implement them in something, and without web components, it's kind of a nightmare, right? I mean, that's probably an understatement.
So to give you an idea, like the backbone-based one that they were using previously, just in terms of like being able to actually inflate that thing and get data rendering on the screen, you were talking like probably in the neighborhood of a minimum maybe 200 lines of JS and like a maximum of maybe 600, something like that, just ballpark. And then with this, you drop it in and you literally say like whatever your grid reference is, .data equals, and then whatever your source is, and you get a more or less functional grid. That made a lot of people happy. But the thing that I found kind of challenging about it was we pride ourselves on trying to anticipate all the needs that people are going to have around it. So your question about like sort of how it's growing more generally, but also definitely along like the needs of our application. When we did our first pass at it, we did not think people were going to want to put drop-downs in a grid. Just didn't think about it. So on this most recent pass, we've spent a lot of time making sure that all those sort of like components that are rendered in funny ways, where stuff's like popping over, actually work properly and as you'd expect, which was a little trickier than I would have liked in an item recycled case, but.
Yeah, the expectations are getting way huge for those type of things. Like it used to be you stuck a table in for tabular data, and now you have each row has its own drop downs. The drop downs trigger this thing to happen, and these inject here. So it's not easy. I can imagine scroll is an issue too. Now, when you're doing, you said, Justin, earlier that you had only a certain amount of elements would render, right? So are you using the GPU to do this? Like, how are you getting performance out of this?
So
GPU was an issue.
So the original implementation was GPU based. We were using Transform 3D, and we were using actually absolute positioning on each row. But then with the need to do things like drop downs in a grid, we were getting clipping problems in certain scenarios. So basically rework the entire underlying infrastructure of the grid to use a specific library that abstracts away the DOM concern. So all it does is like feed you data about what records need to be at what position, and then there's another layer on top of that will actually move. It moves the top. It moves style top on relatively positioned elements instead, and that there were a lot of challenges in that for sure, but Now the grid is actually toggleable, so you can do either 3D or 2D non-GPU representation with just an attribute on the grid itself.
And so how many laptops did you kill in the process of designing this? Because I feel like, you look at, recycling, and from a dome scope is, sort of the way to go. I mean, you look at sort of it's a common technique in that we all pull our hair out about doing it when you have lots and lots of data. Because the DOM, for all its speed, when you give it lots of things, it isn't happy about things. And how stable is it now? I mean, obviously you guys put a ton of work into it because it is on GitHub, and that's a brave thing to put out there as a grid on GitHub. Because I didn't read the comments because sometimes that can be devastating to anybody's. I don't want to ruin my day. I can only imagine you guys having to look at comments on the grid. I mean, do you find people like it? I mean, is it something that after having put all that work in has met your expectations?
To start with your first question, I only broke one laptop, and I'm on the new one right now.
You actually did.
I had forgotten until you actually asked. Yes, the laptop was broken in the process. So we've mostly had only internal use. We haven't had a huge amount of adoption that we've seen anyway from the open source initiative. But internally, people are really happy with it. It is light years ahead of the backbone and just sort of jQuery implementation that we had before. Much more sane to use. I really tried to focus on having excellent default settings, but full customizability. So you can pipe in your own template to give your rows. And the grid itself is actually built on top of another element that the dropdowns also use, which is called the item recycler, which takes care of all the nasty bits in that domain. And then the grid takes the item recycler and it has logic for how to manage its columns properly. So you can customize pretty much all parts of it. The challenges that we've had in terms of stability really come down to in the port to 1.0. There have been huge changes in how data flows and in terms of the notification of paths in child and parent elements. There's some challenges in there, but recently I've started to really just try to grok the existing Polymer code base to see where all the pointy edges are and to make sure that we're avoiding all of them.
And do you guys like 1.0? Like, I know that 0.5 to 1.0 was a big jump for many. I know Eric and I really hammered 0.8 sort of when it was in the sort of test phase of things to really sort of suss out what Polymer 1.0 was going to be. I mean, does 1.0 sort of fit with your world view of sort of the syntactic sugar that you would want for web components?
I think overall, for the most part, it's got a lot of pluses and minuses in my opinion. I really miss the sort of like you can just change data and it automatically updates things in sort of deeper cases for the most part, but I really, really enjoy the way that they've changed all the like sub-property binding stuff. I think that's a good addition, and I really also like the ability to specify one-way binding when you need it. I think the biggest thing that I personally worked on where I really needed that and didn't have it was when we were building a date picker where users can input a date by just like typing, and then there's also a calendar where you can click on stuff, and being able to sort of force those flows into one direction would have been really useful when I'd been building that stuff in 0.5. So it was definitely a nice addition as far as just being able to craft components with it.
I know we kind of assumed that everyone knows what Polymer is, but Polymer is basically just a library on top of web components. Most of our listeners know that already, but in case anyone jumps on, wants to know what that is, they can go to polymer-project.org. And if you look at the source code, like you said, Justin and Dan, I noticed there's so much on the CSS part in 1.0. There's like at least a dozen HTML files just dealing with certain parts of CSS. Did you find that those were where a lot of the rough edges were for you guys?
Definitely there were some, when it comes to styling and theming, we kind of had our own system already built out for how we style and theme all of our elements, and there was a big push in 1.0 for kind of the style module, which makes a lot of sense, and it's definitely going to be cool for all the folks that are kind of trying to globally theme a single-page app. But since we already had infrastructure invested in, we didn't really use that until we kind of ran into some issues with font loading and had to resolve that by switching over to the style module paradigm that's kind of inherent to Polymer 1.0.
Yeah, and you guys are using Sass, so I'm assuming when you say infrastructure, you guys are building up all of your variables and theming at you have the global variables, you have your component variables, and they all just get turned into whatever before runtime happens.
Yep, absolutely.
Right, and some of that's just like legacy essentially, because when we started this, none of this stuff existed. We've been doing it since before there was any kind of like native support in browsers too. So to answer the original sort of question about like why Polymer in the first place in terms of building this stuff, it was because at the time when we started, that was the only game in town. So that's been true of our styling too. Like they didn't have a lot of the niceties around theming. So we're like, well, we want to make stuff as modular as we can internally. So we looked at, what are the preprocessors that are out there at the time. So at the time, Sass and Less were popular, and we were already using Sass for some internal stuff. So it just kind of made sense to.
Yeah, and they had like when Deep and Shadow were out there, we saw libraries appear that were just for theming, where they use that and content, right? And now we know that that's some big hammers. So
yeah, and when we've pushed this to other teams, we've tried to caution the use of any of that, because I know there's some cases where people just need that ability, but in my opinion, like if you're going to translate that into JS terms, it would be like using private APIs, right? It's like stuff that we're sort of publishing, but we don't really want you jumping into our internals unless there's a really good reason for it, because then all of a sudden we're beholden to whatever that markup is. So if we need to make a change internally,
yeah, and Deep caused a lot of problems. I mean, there were perf problems, and during the great web components face-to-face, it kind of got the axe because people, I think everyone sort of agreed it was the wrong road to take in terms of that sort of thing. So, I can only imagine the sort of pain level there.
And apply author styles. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Fun times.
That was how you use JavaScript, just turn it off, right? So you could just go through and pierce every shadow. That was fun. So you guys said that, I think it was Dan who said this, that you guys drive a lot of the design of this and how this works. But I would imagine a lot of that design is driven by MediaMath as far as like for that product, because it's used mostly internally. How do you decide like what is a component? Like, do you have a basic just, okay, well, we can make a button and just style it, and that's a component, versus like the grid, which is like the extreme of that? Like, how do you decide what's important to put as a component in the library?
I think it was important to start out with the smallest building blocks. We've been using a Lego analogy this entire time, where we had to build the tiniest building blocks in order to build more complex things out of those small building blocks. That's why we started with things like buttons and drop-down lists and inputs, with the knowledge that we would then probably build larger widgets out of those things. Or people could just use those piecemeal as they needed them. They would come, already out of the box with the styling and 98% of the functionality that folks need. So really, it was just building kind of the foundation first, and then vetting for what warrants becoming a component, and eventually everything will be a component on some level. So I don't know if that answers the question, but we're moving towards everything being componentized at some point in the nearest future.
And I guess, like, as far as buttons are concerned too, like, even an MM button is not necessarily as straightforward as you might think, because we also want to have interoperability at least with our own stuff initially, and so you can do things like drop an icon in there and it gets positioned correctly and aligned in the place we'd expect and all that kind of stuff. And that was just a little bit easier to do if it was a component, because then you can leverage content tags and stuff like that to make all that just kind of flow seamlessly.
Yeah, there's no right or wrong. I'm not saying that either. Just I am curious though, because from project to project I found that it's very different on how it gets decided on that?
We have sword fights. We just, everyone brings out their long sword, and, you put your components down on the table, and then, it's kind of like, it's a mix between Hercules / Ben-Hur / Game of Thrones. I do not recommend this in your organization. It's not a good management technique.
That's why you keep hiring people.
I don't know how well that would go over in our shop, but it certainly sounds amusing.
There are 2 chairs behind me that are empty for a reason.
They lost sword duels, essentially. That's how they went down.
My components won.
So for MediaMath, Ajax, right, MM-Ajax, is like built on top of Iron Ajax, I believe?
It's not. It's a separate.
It's not, okay.
So originally that existed because they were just starting. Well, Iron wasn't even a thing, and I forgot what the original Google Ajax one was called. Was like
it's Core Ajax, I think.
Yeah, that's what it was.
And then Core XHR was nested inside there.
Yeah, it was like just starting to be a thing. So it didn't have a lot of the features that I wanted, and also had a lot of requirements around interoperability with the higher level stuff like sync. So it needed to expose more of the internals than what they were doing. So that's the reason it's not based on it. Sort of more history than any particular reason. But now in 1.0. we did some testing around. One of the things that we're looking at is having like actual like collection and model components, and I know that that's probably even more controversial than a lot of the stuff that we're doing already. But when you do that, then you wind up with a whole bunch of your like essentially syncing components instances in there, and the memory usage starts getting out of control really quickly because they're all HTML element instances at their core. So in our 1.0 stuff, which is admittedly a lot less battle tested than the previous, what we're doing is moving to a plain JavaScript approach for a lot of this, and then the components are then essentially just wrappers to hook into all the plain JavaScript stuff. So that way, in cases where we're instantiating a ton of these things, it's just JavaScript objects. It's not, getting crazy with a million elements too.
So the DOM never actually updates. It's the JavaScript inside of that element, right?
Right.
Yeah, I really liked that you guys are experimenting with different things on there. It's one of the things that I enjoyed looking through the code was the behavior type of things that you guys do. So in Polymer, they have these behaviors that are shared. They're like mix-ins, as we know. And you guys handle it a little differently. If you look through the source code of Polymer, it gets added onto the prototype, right? But you guys are taking it off a window namespace, like some object on the window, and putting it on there. So I think that's kind of clever. I think I would think that that's more performant. Have you guys done anything to test that?
We haven't, although I am a little bit confused. I'm not exactly sure what you meant by the other prototypes or behaviors. So like templatizer, for instance, that's on like Polymer.templatizer.
The Iron stuff is added directly to Polymer.
Yes, you have these behavior files that get added to the prototype, like when you include them in your properties. So if you look at the properties object on a Polymer object, it'll say behaviors, and then you have these things like Polymer dot whatever ally, for instance, is one of them, the Iron ones. And you can add those behaviors to this particular element if it pertains to that. So if you want keyboard access, for instance, for this particular element, that gets added. And you guys have something like that, but it's handled differently. You guys took a different approach. It's similar in some ways, but it's handled differently, which was interesting. I like that.
I don't think the only real conscious decision we made around it was around handling the namespacing too, because you'll notice there's 3 different namespaces. Strand is all the actual component definitions, so you can say new checkbox, whatever. Strand lib is pretty much all the JavaScript only stuff, and then the strand traits is all the behaviors. So that was the main decision that we made, was to keep those separate. We briefly considered adding them all to Strand and then like sub namespacing Strand too, just to see how that worked out. But in the end, we thought honestly it was a mix of like, do we want to like type this all the time, and
that is the conundrum.
Does it make sense for end developers that are using this? So keeping them separate, like when it's traits, you know exactly what you're getting. It's a behavior. When it's lib, you know what you're getting. It's a JavaScript object. And then with Strand, you know you're getting a component. So that was the main thinking there, and I think a lot of the choices around the the Windows stuff was predominantly because we didn't know, based on what they included in a given time, we don't know who's going to be first to create that object. So that's why we chose the approach that we did for that. Because with Polymer, they're tacking on to Polymer, and Polymer is guaranteed to exist in the namespace because you're importing it first. So
Yeah, I think their approach is, everything is an element, as they said. So, and as you guys said as well. So, but if you look at early native implementations of these sort of things, you can see that a lot of people are using the window object to do this sort of stuff on namespaces. I wonder if you could add it to the document and just keep it there. That'd be interesting.
I imagine when ES 2015++ lands, we'll have a module system for managing a lot of the libraries that would otherwise be in the global namespace in a different way.
Yeah, I forget. I think that there's a way you can do object assignment through object.assign where it doesn't copy it, it actually just points to it. But I'm not sure. So far, the only implementations I've seen are copying. Do you guys know about that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So for object.assign, my understanding is like if you were to use that to assign like a set of methods to, or even properties to an object, it would actually copy, like make copies of those onto the prototype if you did it that way. But I'm hoping there's a way that you can just have a pointer almost, so that you can have, it doesn't actually copy it, it just actually, just points to it, so you can save memory in that case.
I'm not familiar with the assign API, actually.
Okay.
Is that forthcoming in ES6?
Yeah, I think it's either, it might not be, you're right, it might not be in ES 2015 or whatever it is, but it's definitely in that one or the next one, the ES7 or ES 2016, whatever. But yeah, I've been looking at different ways to do that, and imports seem to be a good way to share things without adding it to the prototype and using something like System.js. But I'm still experimenting with that. Have you guys been looking at using transpilers with this stuff?
I'm interested in it. I guess really what it comes down to for me is I had some mixed experiences with CoffeeScript, so I've been kind of put off of transpilers for a little bit.
I hear you.
Which at some point I need to reevaluate that, but the reality is also we're beholden to a roadmap, so we're to some
TypeScript and Babel are actually really good.
It's more than than playing with the fun stuff. But
I mean, TypeScript and Babel have been really good. I'm liking them. I'm finding that the loaders are not as mature as those, though. So if we're using imports, but there's stuff like Steel.js, which is interesting for something like Polymer, because then you can dynamically load these imports with that polyfill. So you're not combining them into one file, and then on page load, it's looking at the imports. It's actually going to load asynchronously.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's interesting.
So still experimenting, though. I was curious if you guys have thought about that, though.
We have. I mean, the biggest thing that keeps me up at night about like the way that we're doing the loads for a lot of it is bundling everything into one file, including our fonts, gets really nasty in some cases. And the idea there is that our releases will be staggered enough that the CDN is going to kind of take some of that brunt away. But the initial load is pretty heavy. That worries me, both in terms of like a performance standpoint, but also in terms of just over the wire. A meg and meg plus is not very fun.
Yeah, and I think too asynchronous, even like playing. I haven't played with Steel.js yet, but I plan on it. But I would imagine because of the synchronous nature of custom elements right now, it wouldn't interrupt so well. Just starting to play with that now, so I'll have painful answers, I'm sure. There's media query in the element for media queries internally for Polymer. Most of their elements, if not all, that are UI based are going to be responsive, right? If you're building on a mobile platform, how do you get these to work well for you there? I mean, something like Grid, obviously, if you make that responsive, man, I am importing that.
So I think I can kind of speak to this a little bit. We have to also go back into history to kind of understand the visual design and the support that we're beholden to. And a lot of MediaMath's clients are either brands or advertising agencies, and typically fairly technologically savvy folks. A lot of them are on desktop when they're interacting with our UI. So Unlike the kind of modern paradigm of mobile first, we designed this project for kind of desktop first because that was our audience, that's our user base. We did the very best that we could to design the individual Strand web components to kind of flow into a layout, so that they could be used in a mobile responsive layout. Things like the grid ultimately probably don't reduce as well to like a few hundred pixels wide, just because of the amount of information that you're trying to fit in there. Obviously, it was just like a first name, last name. We could totally fit that on the screen, but
that's never the case, right? Everybody wants an Excel document on their page.
Yeah, it's always very, very detailed. So we really targeted kind of desktop first, and at some point later in time, I'm sure we'll think about probably new visual designs that are a little bit more mobile friendly.
I can see it being an unfair question too, because there's a lot of web components stuff out there that is just considering desktop, right? Just laptops or whatever you want to say. And like a grid, yes, it's not meant to be on mobile, right? You're not going to be using your BlackBerry to go through that, or your
probably not.
Your iPhone.
You just gave me a really interesting idea about zooming in the grid, though, which I may have to spend an afternoon taking a look at.
Yeah, I mean, you could do the grid on mobile. It would just have to look totally different, right? You'd have to, and to design it, you'd need to work with UX people who are UX savvy for sure.
Absolutely.
But it is an interesting question, though, right? I mean, a lot of times we think about web components and the things that we're sort of building now in sort of a consumer perspective, where you have a large amount of target platforms that you're going to hit. But in corporate, it does work differently, right? I mean, we work on corporate stuff too, and if you get to a tablet size, that might be a rarity. Though every once in a while, someone's going to ask you, why can't my 50-column grid fit on my iPhone 4? I don't know why you have an iPhone 4, and I don't know why you want a 50-column grid on that screen. But use cases come up and go, and I think that's a very hard problem. I think responsive, I love responsive as much as the next person, but man, it's a hell of a thing to hit.
It's also for corporate to make it go backwards. So you have this 50-column grid that you've designed, and now there's a requirement. Oh, by the way, our team lead over in Germany or whatever has been viewing this all on his iPad at portrait, and you need to make it work in that. And then you have to go back and redesign the entire component because you didn't think of it in that context first, because it's easier to get bigger. It's harder to get smaller as far as designing something.
That's definitely the challenge, and that's an experienced design and a visual design challenge that we would be happy to undertake, but we've got more work ahead of us before we jump into that one.
Certainly, one of the other things that we've been really careful about, though, is just to have really good abstraction. So the logic that it takes to render and item recycle the grid should be fairly separate from how each individual row gets presented. So if it's just a matter of having each row have a little bit of extra responsive juice mixed into it, you should be able to use a lot of the existing infrastructure the way that we've architected it so far to do much of the work for you.
And web developers everywhere, thank you. Because it is, I can't really stress this enough, especially for our starting out listeners. The web has always been a Wild West, and now we have more APIs, and now we have more screens, and we have more power to do things, but with power comes the ability to really mess things up. Having frameworks and libs and the sort of things that we have now, where we have tooling, which is something that realistically we did not have on the web for a long time, right? We all had our own homegrown stuff. We all, new person A comes in for an interview, sits down the first day of their job, and then wants to cry because who in the world wrote this non-documented thing? Because it's a nightmare. So things like that where you're taking into account, I don't think framework owners or people who are building components or libs or whatever don't get enough credit for the actual work they put in on those things. So I really do, personally, thank you for doing that work.
Yeah, here.
You're very welcome.
I have one more question, and this is going to be sort of a troll question. So why MM dash? It's very semantic. It reminds me of NG dash, where it's I want to like just punch my Angular elements in the face. So
It's simple. It's just MediaMath.
yeah, I got that.
You got to push the brand.
Yeah,
That's the brand. All about the brand.
Push the brand. Okay. You could have spelled out MediaMath, but it's too long. I got you.
Would you want to type that all day? We don't want to type
I
it all
would
day.
not, but I would understand. Yeah, I got you.
That was the main thing was length of it, and then the other piece too was I really kind of felt like versus going with Strand. I was thinking about the old school like Java style namespacing where it was like com.MediaMath in this case, or something like that. And my personal take was like maybe that's how the namespacing should be used. And I don't know that everyone's necessarily come to an agreement on that yet. I mean, may they have, but like if you look at what Google's doing, they have like 3 or 4 different namespaces that they're playing with. So that was my thought is eventually, if web components really takes off, we're going to get to a point where that becomes really critical to make sure that you're not colliding with everybody else. So we might as well start from a place of like thinking about those collisions.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to solve. I remember Zeno Rocha wrote an article last year, the year before even, and we still haven't figured it out. He wrote an article on naming your components, right? I think it's on webcomponents.org way back.
That's a computer science problem. And naming your kids is hard. Same sort of fiasco.
Yeah, so it makes you think about like, should I name this as what it's responsible for, what kind of data it might have, or what it is, or things like that. And there's no right answer. It's just we have to figure it out as a community what the patterns are and what we should look at.
If I can interject for a moment, because this is a particular topic of concern for me in general.
Contentious.
Yes. So I may end up in a bit of a rant, so stop me at any time. But I think I think that identifiers in general are silly, and that ideally all elements should be like have some unique identifier, some hexadecimal string on top of maybe a very simple namespace, and really the tools should enable us to talk about what the elements are at a higher level. There should be aliases for the components that we work with. It shouldn't necessarily be built into the literal text that specifies how it works. The analogy I kind of use is in file systems today. Your hardware doesn't care what your file names are. That's just for the people to talk about. And you can have copies of files that are named differently but have the same underlying. You can have symbolic links between files in a way that makes it more usable for the end user, but the computer takes care of all the hard bits. And so naming in general, I think, is an industry-wide problem that we're not even trying to tackle in the right ways.
Yeah, definitely. I look at it too as if I gave this component to somebody where all they knew was basic HTML and they didn't know any JavaScript or anything, could they actually understand what it is?
I let my cat walk across my keyboard to name all my components. So that is
the best way.
I feel like that's a good random cat generator just to sort of, is it do you know what it does? No. But naming-wise, very easy for me.
And I also have to say, for the record, I'm surprised that the troll question was about namespacing and it wasn't about our behaviors, because I don't know if you've looked in the behaviors folder, but it gets a little absurd.
There's a lot in there for sure, but
and they all end in the letters ABLE.
Yeah. That's all right though. I like seeing different ways that people are tackling these things, and I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just different. I was just curious if you had more performance stuff that you guys have tested on that. I don't test for performance usually too much until the later stages, so I'm sort of a hypocrite in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a design constraint that we try to work with when we're doing this stuff, but it's one of many design constraints as well, so that's kind of how we approach it. I will say, though, that we did on 0.5 run into some pretty fun stuff when you start mixing other code in with Polymer, which was people were using D3 to do a bunch of charting, and when your charts get pretty intense, your DOM count gets pretty intense too, because all the SVG stuff is still technically part of the DOM. So when you start introducing the old, somewhat more intrusive polyfills for that, it got exciting really quickly. That was when we wound up contributing a little bit to Polymer itself to try to work around some of that.
Well, we're all better for it. Thank you. If people want to contribute to the project, or they want to use it or learn more about it, do you guys have any YouTube videos or any recorded meetups? I know you guys did a meetup in Chicago a while back. Do you have anything else other than the docs that people could look at to get started?
Unfortunately, at the moment, we do not. There's a recording out there of our Fluent Conf talk, which is kind of high level, and then we've got the documentation on GitHub. GitHub.com/MediaMath/Strand is where to find all of that stuff.
Certainly, after the port to 1.0, we've been pretty heads down, just trying to get all of the existing functionality into the newest version of the framework. But we're definitely planning to spend a lot more time on making it as accessible as possible, both internally and externally, for people to get up to speed on Strand.
I think it took me like a month to go from 0.5 to 1 on Polymer. Like I was just like beating my head against all of the errors I was getting in 0.8, and I just gave up on 0.8. And then 0.9 came out right away, and I was like, oh, thank God, and beating my head some more. And then 1.0 fixed most of the stuff on there, and so it was easier to grok. You know, like when you're trying to learn how the API has changed, and then, you know, it's breaking underneath you. That's hard. But to be fair, it wasn't a 1.0 release or anything. But yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, I think we definitely, in the porting process, experienced sort of like, oh, this is going pretty well. It's easy when we were doing all the smaller stuff, like, you know, button and even to some degree like drop down and stuff like that. And then you get to grid, and that experience changed rather dramatically in the course of about a week. So
I would imagine.
That was definitely where the bulk of the work went into in porting, was grid, and like I'd sort of hinted at, the interoperability between things that render over the screen in various ways, like popovers and tooltips and drop downs and all that kind of stuff. Which really, when you're looking at it, I'm like, I almost wish that something existed in the spec that allowed for like a layer, because really at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is mimic native in a sort of skinned way for a lot of our lower level stuff. And you can't at some level, because we just don't have all the pieces. Like everyone always uses the video tag example when they're trying to explain web components, but like they're doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes for video tag that we just don't have access to even with web components. So it'd be cool to be able to get closer to native with some of this in terms of what we'd be able to build if we had a couple more features.
You mean more APIs for these things?
But even like looking at like having some sort of almost like z-indexing where you can specify like, hey, this is a UI level piece. Because if you look at how like a select works natively, right, it's a native widget. It's not even browser in most cases, right? It's actually, you know, you look on OS 10, it's an OS 10 rendered thing, and so it's popping over the top of everything, even outside of the actual browser Chrome, and then behaving in a very specific way. And we just don't have the tooling to emulate something like that, and it's also not a skinnable component as it stands right now. So
yeah, those are my favorite to style.
Yeah, right there with you on that. But I mean, like one of the things that I think personally would be awesome is if that was actually implemented as a component internally, and then like for some of our use case, like why reinvent the wheel over and over again with that? If we have a nice theming setup, then we could just sort of plug into that.
It's true. Even outside of web components, most of the JavaScript plugins you see is like, you know, divs and spans just wrapped all together. Maybe they add some, you know, ally stuff and some accessibility, hopefully. But it's, yeah, if it was native, that would be so much better. Appearance just doesn't cover all the cases, for sure. The appearance CSS rule. You know, IE 10 especially has some issues with that. If people want to contribute, they can go to the GitHub, right? And that's at Math Media's GitHub, or is it
MediaMath /
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
Happens to the best of us, yeah, don't worry.
There is like a Math Media thing, though, out there, I think. I think that's, when I was researching, that's what threw me. But yes, you guys have the cooler logo, for sure. All right, so thank you guys for coming on. Can you guys tell us your Twitter handles, how people can find you to learn more about Strand and web components in general? So
at StrandLib is where we're doing all of our announcements and whatnot, and yeah, check us out at StrandLib.
So if people want to grab you, that's the best place to go?
That would be the spot.
Nice. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Looking forward to see what's coming new from you guys at Strand, or on the Strand project.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us on.
It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at Plus the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at eIsaacson
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.